All right, we got the whole thing up there, Abby. Looks good.
Looks great.
Perfect. All right, thanks. So I'm here to speak about Manoomin tonight. Mostly talk about some of the work we've done and about the biology of wild rice. So it's always my my favorite topic to talk about. So again, thanks for the opportunity. These I'll be talking about tonight. When I give my full wild rice talk, sometimes we go into the cultural importance and harvest, things like that. But tonight, we decided to focus on these topics here. Wild rice biology, some of the monitoring and survey work that we do, and perhaps opportunity for others to help out with, and then some conservation or stewardship activities as well to work with wild rice. So I do want to say a few words about who we are, what we do, tribes, treaty rights, things like that. Excuse me again. This could be a whole separate talk on its own, but I'll just hit the highlights here quick. So under the Treaty of 1854, bands retained the right to hunt and fish and gather in this 1854 ceded territory. It's important to remember that word retain too. These weren't special rights granted anyway. Bands always had these rights, and so they're retained under the treaty. So the treaty language had some stipulations where the bands that reside in the territory can continue to hunt, fish, and gather. So that's essentially what the 1854 Treaty Authority does. We're governed by two of these bands, the Bois Forte and Grand Portage bands. Those two tribal councils make up our board of directors. So our focus is to deal with that off-reservation hunting, fishing, gathering rights. So we set fishing and hunting seasons, limits, register animals, things like that. So again, to make sure the band members can get out there and exercise their rights. Our band members are not required to get a state license. They have identification cards saying, hey, I'm a band member exercising my treaty rights. So we also manage those ID cards as well. Fond du Lac does also exercise treaty rights in that same area. They manage their own off-reservation rights, so they're not part of our organization, but we work with them quite a bit since the same territory. So yeah, we're active in a bunch of different things, wild rice for sure, but we do a lot of work with fish and wildlife, invasive species, climate change, environmental review, just a little bit of everything. So we're really interested in protecting and enhancing the resources of that area, and also any policies and decisions like that that could impact the health of that ceded territory. So that's kind of the world we work in, is that 1854 ceded territory. So the bands are actually co-managers of the resource. So we work with all the other state and federal agencies to make sure that the resources are preserved and protected for future generations, essentially. All right, on to Manoomin. We'll start here a little bit with the biology. It is a member of the grass family, although it is classified as a Minnesota state grain, which is kind of interesting, but it is a grass. Over the years, there has been quite a bit of taxonomic confusion over it. I think that's kind of simmered down a little bit. So it is an annual species, meaning it grows from seed each year, and there's two species in our Great Lakes region here. Most of it is Zamia palustris, or northern wild rice. So that covers in the states, Minnesota, Wisconsin, into Michigan, but there's also another species, aquatica, or southern wild rice, that occasionally is found in parts of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So there's two different species in the Great Lakes region. And there's some other perennial species I have listed there. I don't really know much about them, but there are some other species of wild rice as well. That's kind of interesting, and not in our neck of the woods here at all. So again, I said it's an annual plant, meaning it grows from seed each year, and it grows best in shallow lakes and rivers. So when you're thinking about wild rice habitat, you're thinking 1 to 3 feet of water. It can grow deeper, 4, 5, 6, 8 feet occasionally, but that's really your prime window, is at 1 to 3 feet of water depth. And then you have that soft, mucky, organic bottom. That's what wild rice prefers. And again, you see it growing in all kinds of bottoms. So I've seen it in sandy, rocky, gravelly, but again, the prime is that soft bottom, and shallow water is really what wild rice prefers. So each spring it grows from seed soon after ice out in the spring. And then June, which is the picture on the lower left, is when it reaches that floating leaf stage. So it forms these dense leafy mats on the water surface. And it's during this floating leaf stage that it's really susceptible to water level changes. So if you get a big storm event, for example, that raises that water a foot or more, it could uproot those plants. And it can also essentially drown them out if that water level stays high for an extended period of time. It'll drown out those growing wild rice plants. So that floating leaf stage in June into early July is really critical each season if the water levels change significantly. And then in July, and the other photo there, that's when the plants begin to stand out of the water. Most plants, 1 to 3, 1 to 4 feet is typically what you see, but I've seen them 6, 8 feet, 10 feet tall out of the water. So definitely a wide variety. So the plant is wind pollinated, and that occurs in late July. It's during this time when the kernels or seeds begin to fill with a milky substance in early August, and then eventually that becomes the seed or the grain of the plant, and that's on the very tip of the plant in the diagram here. So the seeds ripen in late August or early September, and that's when they fall into the sediment and basically are the future generations of wild rice. It's during this time also too that harvest occurs. Sounds like we probably have many harvesters on the line. So late August into September is when the seeds are ripening, and that's when harvesters are out as well. Harvesters also know about the varied ripening. Wild rice seeds ripen at varied times. So seeds on the same plant ripen at different times. Areas of a same lake or river ripen at different times, and different lakes and rivers ripen at varied times. So harvesters know you can continue to hit the same bed several times over a season, or hop around to different areas as the rice is ripening at different times. This is really kind of the series of a lake in a given year, what it looks like. Upper left is May, so it's, for people who haven't seen a wild rice lake across the whole season, it's very interesting. You get there in early spring, it's an open water lake, and you see how it progresses to this. It can look like a field. So May, then we will move down to the right on the top is that floating leaf stage. A little hard to see in that photo, but you can see kind of the leafy mat going on top of the water. And then in July, it starts to stand in the water, and then by end of August, it's ripening and ready for harvest, and eventually the seeds fall back into the lake or the river. Wild rice seed has an ability to remain dormant, so it's really adaptive to changing conditions over time. Some of the literature talks about how seeds can remain dormant in the sediment for 5 years, 7 years. I've read things like that, but I think it's even longer. I've heard of stories 20 years, 30 years, even longer, where maybe even no rice was seen on a given water body, and something could change. Maybe a beaver dam blows out or something that's been there for 20 years, and all of a sudden rice just pops back. So it's amazing how that seed is in the sediment, just waiting for the right conditions to start growing. You can see here on Kettle Lake, this is south of Duluth. On the left was after the 2012 flood. We didn't find any wild rice growing in the lake. All of it had been uprooted when we had that huge storm. And that a year later, almost to the day, 2013, you can see how different these lakes look across years. One year you have nothing. Next year it can look like a field. So it's really that highly adaptive and changes over time quite a bit. A lot of people also talk about this 4 or 5 year cycle. This is a picture of Round Island Lake, just kind of north of Finland for people familiar, where you have maybe 1 banner year for wild rice, 2 mediocre, and 1 bust. So you can see that kind of plays out here. We have a couple mediocre years, a really good year, and a bad year over a 4-year time. And it's hard. This isn't a set in stone cycle. It just really shows how wild rice varies across years. A lot of it's dependent on water levels. This past season, we had those drought conditions and really low water, which in general was good for wild rice, made getting to it and harvest hard, but the lower waters were good for wild rice growth. There's also some research that's been shown some nutrient cycling comes into play as well, where you have all those nutrients tied up in straw after a good wild rice year. And so probably those things work together to kind of have this cycle that it naturally occurs with wild rice. Wild rice is habitat. Waterfall. If you ever talk to duck hunters, they often look for wild rice beds to hunt. Waterfall really like wild rice. You see a variety of other birds. I see red-winged blackbirds and sora rails, things like that are very common in the rice. Muskrat's an interesting one. Some people could view muskrat as a potential threat or negative impact to wild rice. They do uproot some wild rice. On the flip side, I've heard a lot of people, tribal members and elders consider muskrat a benefit for wild rice. I've been heard muskrat called as the gardeners or cleaners of a lake. So, are they dealing with competing vegetation? That could be a thing that's benefiting wild rice. Are they, mucking around the sediment and promoting wild rice growth? So muskrat are, An interesting one, and thought to perhaps even benefit wild rice, that in a healthy wild rice bed, you often see muskrat. Can form habitat for fish species. Other things I've seen, deer and moose standing in wild rice beds and foraging in on it. I don't know if that's a major thing, but another thing could potentially use wild rice as well. So other things, maybe these could be classified as impacts or threats to wild rice. Climate change and everything related that goes with climate change is probably the big one. In 2016, we worked with Bois Forte, Grand Portage, and Fond du Lac and did develop our own climate vulnerability assessment and adaptation plan. So basically for wild rice, we were like, try to outline how threatened is it from climate change and what are potential strategies we can do to help benefit wild rice. And that plan's on our website as well, if anyone's interested in checking out the whole plan or the wild rice section. But these are some big things here that we have listed about how could climate change impact wild rice. The big one is probably changing water levels. I just talked about that 2012 flood near Duluth, how never seen such high water and basically wiped out wild rice that year. Big storm events, things like that, we're potentially seeing more of that. How is that going to impact wild rice in the long haul? It's tough to get a handle on these, the difference between weather and year to year versus long-term, climate impacts. Altered growing season, we're seeing this where less ice cover, earlier springs, later ice up. We're doing some work trying to track ice cover. So how does that impact wild rice germination and growth? How does that impact competing vegetation? Is other vegetation going to get a foothold on wild rice? This year, for example, many lakes, for some reason, I saw a lot more water shield. For some reason, the conditions this year, if it was low water or the spring, I'm not sure, but it seemed to benefit water shield over wild rice in some spots. So, how does that play out in the long haul? Different pests and diseases too. How does climate affect that? We're seeing more brown spot disease. It's a fungal disease that grows on wild rice leaves. Often you see a little bit of it, and that's not a big deal, but sometimes it can really take over and actually damage or kill a wild rice bed. I'm talking to some of the folks in Wisconsin, they have been seeing more and more in this. Last several years, I've been seeing a little bit in Minnesota where I hadn't seen it before. So that's something we're trying to keep a track on. Are these hot, humid nights, is that increasing things like brown spot disease? We're getting more of that in northern Minnesota. Rice worms, there's a little bit of work, I think Leech Lake Band's doing some work on rice worms about how prevalent they are and how is climate changing that. Anyone who knows, as a harvester knows that it's moth lays their larvae and the rice worms actually consume the wild rice seeds, and it can have impact on the harvest and on the reproductive success of the plant. So how does climate change affect rice worms? We really don't have a good handle on that at all yet. Different animal populations. We do some wild rice restoration work in the St. Louis River and Duluth here, which I'll talk about, but almost every plant that begins to stand is getting nipped off by geese. So, again, this is a related climate thing. We're seeing more and more geese, swans, the last 5-10 years, almost every wild rice lake now you see swans. So, what does that impact? So different things that just change over time we're trying to keep track of. Finally, with the climate thoughts, at least, weather, especially during harvest time, it seems like we get these big wind events. When ripe rice is ready for harvest, the wind comes and takes it all off. It's good for the wild rice, bad for the harvesters. Same with heavy rain events or hail events. How's that going to hurt wild rice, especially during that time when it's ripe and ready for harvest? And the other, your human disturbances. We're seeing more development on shallow lakes, and then people want, open water in front of their cabin. They move in and want to change the character of the lake, removing vegetation. They want deeper water for recreation, even boating, things like that, boating through wild rice. All that is, potentially has a negative impact on rice over time. So we're really trying to educate people of, what wild rice is and the importance of it. We get any questions yet, Abby? Are we good?
You're good to keep going.
All right, I'll keep plugging away. This has been big in the news over the last probably close to a decade now, a sulfate water quality standard. Minnesota does have a water quality standard for sulfate. After additional research has shown that sulfate gets converted to sulfide and has a negative impact on wild rice. And so, bands and others are asking the questions to industry, why aren't you meeting the standard? To the state agencies and the EPA, why aren't you enforcing the standard? And so this led in a lot of discussions and research over the last decade on the standard. I think for the protective abilities of the standard, Pollution Control Agency has begun to list impaired waters. So lakes with wild rice that are not meeting the standard, they're going to be listed as impaired. So that will hopefully, at least for the wild rice, have some movement in doing activities and implementing the standard, implementing water rules. So these standards are going to be met moving forward. So we're hopefully going to make some progress on this moving forward. All right, so as we developed our wild rice program, probably in the mid 1990s, my first thought is, where is wild rice found in the 1854 ceded territory? Again, that's our focus area for Bois Forte and Grand Portage members. So we were interested in where is it currently present? Where was it historically present? So back in 1996, we worked with a grad student out of UMD to develop an initial list of wild rice waters in the ceded territory. So he combed through any DNR reports, Forest Service information, anything he could find that listed wild rice presence. So that was our kind of initial inventory list, if you will. So we do update that every year as we acquire new information. I read different reports that mention wild rice. I'll stumble across in the field, talk to harvesters, other agency folks. So each year it'll make it tweaked a little bit, maybe a new addition or two, but something we just keep current on and where wild rice is found in the ceded territory. Another question too, my habit is, what is a wild rice water? That's a point of debate. For us, it's if it has any wild rice at all. Other people maybe try to define it of like a minimal quantity or density threshold, but to us, does it have wild rice or did it have wild rice? So that's what we call wild rice water. There's no official designation or definition of a wild rice water in Minnesota. So here's a map of northeastern Minnesota, the ceded territory. This is our master list of wild rice waters in that territory. So currently it's at 523 wild rice waters. Most of these are unique waters, but sometimes on a big lake, it may be individual bays, or a river may have several river stretches. So that's a little caveat, but in general, over 500 wild rice waters. And so since 1996, we've been trying to visit these waters to get an idea of how much wild rice is present, general lake characteristics, things like that. So since going through 2021, we've made it to 373 out of these 523 waters, with other partners have helped us as well. So it's a lot of work. Slowly pecking away at visiting all these waters as we're able. So here's our general wild rice survey. It's pretty short and sweet. Is wild rice present? What's the bottom like? How deep a water? Beaver activity, human activity, other vegetation. So it's a real just quick snapshot look at the lake. And again, this is a one-time look at it. So, if it's a lake we're not familiar with, we show up in 2021, was that a bad year or a good year for wild rice on lake? We really don't know. So most of these is a one-time shot. A lot of them we revisit as well to resurvey if we think it was a bad year for wild rice, for example. We may go back and visit again to see if there is wild rice. So something we just keep pecking away at. There's also been some statewide initiatives to look at where wild rice is in Minnesota. Bois Forte and Grand Portage ran a project back in 2002 to develop a statewide list, was part of the efforts. There's a big study by the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources in 2008, really talked about the importance of wild rice, the biology, where is it found in the state, worked with a bunch of other tribal partners. It was a really good effort. So there's a list developed through that efforts in 2008. The DNR continues to update their list. I think the latest full-blown updates are 2013, but I think it's an ongoing process. And then the Pollution Control Agency really did a really good job in 2017, related to the whole sulfate standard. They're trying to identify anywhere in Minnesota where wild rice was present. So their list was very comprehensive, and they did a good job at combing all sources and combining all sources in 2017. So here's a map of Minnesota as a whole, and this was taken, I think, mostly from those latest PCA efforts, because that was the most comprehensive. So, over 2,300 waters in the state, have at least some wild rice. And again, this is an ongoing thing as we acquire more information. So we have over 500 waters in the Cedar territory. Our thought process is, well, how are we going to narrow that down and focus on a smaller subset where we can do more in-depth monitoring. So this is what we came up with and started back in 1998. We picked a smaller subset of waters, 10 in the Cedar territory, to do more in-depth monitoring every year. Why did we pick these? One, they have harvest potential. Harvesters use them. Two, they're spread out geographically, so different parts of the Cedar territory may be getting different weather every year, so we want them spread out. And probably the third thing is they're accessible. They're fairly easily accessible. We can get to them, not a huge chore to get to them and visit them. So on these lakes, each year, one thing we track beginning soon after ice out is water depth. It's pretty crude, I guess. Our depth meters are essentially a PVC pipe in 1-inch increments and embedded in the lake bottom. So we'll visit every couple weeks to get a depth reading so you can see the change over that season. We do survey these gauges to a arbitrary elevation on shore so we can get accurate comparisons across years. So we know, hey, Kramer Lake is 6 inches deeper this year than it was last year at that time. So we can get a pretty good comparison across years. And then on one specific lake, Big Rice Lake, north of Virginia, for people familiar with that spot, definitely a prime historical location for wild rice harvest, a lake we really care about a lot and trying to do restoration work. So there we do have some electronic equipment where it takes water depths, every day or once an hour. University of Minnesota has some gear up there as well. So a lot of partners doing work up there, and there we have some more automated equipment to track water depths. Water quality, we do have a portable water quality meter we'll take when we visit. It has, dissolved oxygen, pH, conductivity, stuff like that. And then once a year at each of these lakes in our monitoring program, again, these 10 waters, we do take water samples and submit to a lab for analysis. We have about 15 different constituents we monitor and have the lab analyze each year. And again, just base information across years, essentially. So now on the water, when we monitor wild rice, the first thing we do is we set a grid of GPS points across the water, and we shoot anywhere from 30 to 40 usually. This is an example of Kramer Lake, just up the road from Finland there. So Kramer Lake can have wild rice essentially across the whole lake. So our grid of points covers that lake. So each year we'll visit those same points. The example on the bottom right is a spot down the St. Louis River near Duluth. That bay has some deeper areas in the middle that does not support wild rice. So our grid of points there is customized, as you will, if you will, just so to target on the areas that can contain wild rice. So again, these are our monitoring points. We hit same points year after year. So out on the water, be 2 people in a canoe and navigate to all these GPS points. And at each point, then we put that plot over the edge there. It's a half a square meter, and we count the number of wild rice stalks within a plant. So any round stalk that's growing within that area. And then on one plant, we'll measure the total plant height. We'll do that. We'll talk about a little bit. We'll use that calculation to develop a biomass estimate. So again, at each point, count the number of stalks and measure a plant essentially. Then we'll also record other observations, what other vegetation is in that plot, the number of tillers or extra stalks growing on a plant. A lot of times one wild rice plant can have 3, 4, 6, 8 stalks growing out of that same plant. Try to make a better note of brown spot, rice worm, impacts from geese, things like that, again, to get at some of those climate impacts. So let's get a little in depth, not to go too much into it, but basically from either that plant height or the number of seeds on a plant, you can get a biomass estimate. So that's what we do. We have a generic biomass equation that's been developed. And then some people want to go more in depth, they can do their own equations developed specifically for their lake if they want to collect plants and dry plants, do a bunch of weighing, things like that. So basically you plug it in the formula and you get a biomass estimate for a lake each year after you do these density estimates. So here's an example of what it looks like. We summarize all results in an annual report that's on our website as well. But example for Campers Lake, again, you can see there's a biomass graph as well as number of stocks per meter squared. So again, over time, you see the change. Campers Lake, you have good years, bad years, and everything in between. You can just see that fluctuation over time. And this looks similar for most lakes as well. And all these procedures for monitoring are summarized in a monitoring field guide and handbook. This was developed back in 2015, largely modeled after what we've been doing in 1854 Treaty Authority and as well as the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. So basically the idea was to standardize this protocol so other people in the region are doing it in the same or similar fashion. It is available on the Minnesota Sea Grant website if anyone wants more information. It really gives you a suite of things you can do. You can go way in depth or just short and sweet as well. So it gives you definitely options on how to monitor and with the goal again of people doing it in a similar fashion across the region. Some other things at the lake. So phenology or the timing of things. We do have some time-lapse cameras at a couple wild rice waters. So we have them out all season. We try to capture ice off. Then we get the growing season of wild rice and ice on. So we can get exact ice on, ice off days. So over time, we should be able to see, is that ice duration changing? You get cool videos of the rice growing each year. It's pretty cool. We're on about our 5th year of doing that. We also have some temperature and humidity loggers out a couple places. Again, over time, is this going to show changes in temperatures, humidity relating to brown spot, other things like that? And we're only in a few years of doing that. So we'll see if that shows a change over 10 years, 20 years, things like that. We've got a program to monitor ice thickness and snow depth at some wild rice waters. This carries on to some fishery lakes and to some moose habitat areas as well. But again, just tracking those conditions over time. It seems like snow depth is one information piece that's really lacking quite a bit in northeastern Minnesota, we found out. So we're trying to pick up the slack there a little bit and get other partners involved as well. Aerial photo. So we fly each year from 2007 through currently good cooperative effort with Fond du Lac Band, DNR, and Forest Service. We fly over about 2 days each fall. It's usually end of August, beginning of September, about 80 waters across the region. This is Kramer Lake, same lake we've been talking about. So again, that really shows the change in rice over time. I'm a big picture guy. I think that shows a lot how that changes over time. Also make a lot of these photos available for wild rice harvesters, information for them to get out to see where they would like to harvest. Some conservation or stewardship activities. The big thing for wild rice is water levels. If you have prolonged too deep water, rice will not grow well. So beaver is an ongoing thing we work on. We hire beaver trappers, work with the DNR and some of their beaver management as well. I mean, that's the big thing for wild rice is water level management. If you're having poor rice, that's kind of the first step, is to look at your water levels. And again, the goal is not to always keep low and stable water. That potentially could favor other plant species. So again, I mentioned how rice likes turmoil, likes good years and bad years. That's good for the long-term benefit of wild rice. We're not trying to have a field of wild rice every year in a given lake. That's just not reality and probably not good for in the long haul. So we do beaver control, but again, we got to keep in mind the long-term health of wild rice and not just necessarily every year. In some places, if wild rice has been lost or we're establishing a new spot, we do reseeding. Again, that's kind of after the water level issues are figured out. We usually try to buy from harvesters and then get it seeded within a day or two. And just, as you can see from the picture, throw it in. Essentially, you're targeting those shallow areas with the mucky bottom. There has been some work on competing vegetation on big rice in particular. There's a plant called pickerelweed that's taking over. So there's been some cutting with air boats to try to knock that back a little bit to give rice an edge. Some of the restoration areas in St. Louis River, same thing, trying to remove some competing vegetation to kind of give rice a chance and give it a foothold. But rice essentially has to find its niche. It's present with all other vegetation out there. Even you see a thick wild rice bed, there's all kinds of other vegetation present as well. I mentioned beaver dams. This is an example at Round Island Lake this past year. We had a trapper working that. And then Big Rice Lake, again, north of Virginia. Large wild rice lake, almost 2,000 acres, historically great harvest location. Over the last 13 years or so, there's rice present as shown in this picture from 2021, but it just hasn't really thickened up enough for good harvest. So there's a big outdoor heritage project going on with partners with Fond du Lac and DNR, Forest Service, University of Minnesota is involved. So what can we do to try to get rice going a little better there. So we keep working on it. Each year I'm hoping this is the year, but we just kind of stay at stable low levels essentially. So it's a little bit of a head scratcher, but we're plugging away. I mentioned St. Louis River several times. The St. Louis River estuary in Duluth used to have vast stands of wild rice. Most of it essentially lost from, dredging, pollution, industrial activities, things like that. So back in 2014, a bunch of partners came together and developed a wild rice restoration plan. And then after that, beginning in 2015, basically implemented that plan. Again, us working with Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, Fond du Lac Band, Minnesota and Wisconsin DNRs, Pollution Control Agency, just a real good team effort down there. So since 2015, we've seeded almost 60,000 pounds in 14 locations, covering about 260 acres. I did mention here are two things that were holding us up were water levels. People know how Lake Superior has been so high, and that really influences the estuary as well. This last year, though, the estuary and the lake came down close to a foot, I think, and that really jumpstart wild rice growth. We saw big improvements in 2021. Again, the issue there is geese. Almost every plant that emerges is getting nipped off by geese. So we're trying to figure out what can do about that. A goose hazing issue, opportunities, removal opportunities. How can we get a handle on geese a little bit to give rice a chance to become self-sustaining down there? Research, this has just really boomed in the last 5+ years. The amount of people interested in wild rice is just amazing. It's light and day difference from how it was 10, 20 years ago, which is a good thing. We always remind researchers to make sure research is done in the right way, though. Bands are protectors of the wild rice, and so it's important to coordinate with the tribal communities and get them involved in an early and meaningful way. Historically, a lot of times researchers would say, hey, we're submitting this research proposal, it's due Friday, you guys want to sign on? And that's not the way to do it. So I think we're seeing a huge improvement. Let's work together to develop projects up front, put for funding together, work cooperatively on these projects. And so a lot of progress has been made. And again, here's a list of some stuff going on. That's probably not all of it. It's overwhelming how much, and it's a good thing. Again, as long as the work is done in the right way, in a respectful way, and recognizing the tribal interest in wild rice and the cultural importance. And this is not maybe directly conservation or stewardship, but it all kind of comes into play together. So we do all kinds of cooperation, coordination, different annual managers meeting with all the wild rice managers in the region, working with other tribal partners and different work groups. We do a lot of public outreach. We run a wild rice camp every year with other partners. We've done different workshops for making rice knockers and push poles. I mentioned a little bit about our website. Harvesters probably are aware of that. We provide condition updates on our website. And I don't want to give away anyone's little honey hole for harvesting, but on the flip side, we really want to recruit, retain harvesters, make sure they're doing it in the right way. The harvesters are the people who are going to care about wild rice. And so there's a big push to get harvesters out there, get new people harvesting, things like that. So all these things come into play as far as the long-term protection of wild rice and just recognizing the importance of it. So what can I do? Yeah, Abby and I talked a little bit, we talked about harvesters and people interested in wild rice. How can I help with survey management, monitoring? And, I'll share a few thoughts here. I mentioned that the general lake survey we did, again, we hit 373 out of the 500 waters. There's a bunch that yet to go, and some of them are difficult access at this point. So if anyone is interested, they can identify wild rice, a little adventure filling out a survey sheet, let me know. I can sure give you the list of lakes that we still need to hit. I think that's an opportunity. Monitoring, I mentioned those 10 lakes where we have those depth gauges. The more depth readings, the better. I did have a volunteer out of Finland working and checking Kramer Lake for me. So he would, every week or two, send me a list of depth checks he did. And that was very helpful because we only get up there every couple of weeks. And maybe we miss a storm event or things like that. So it'd be good to document depths. So that's an option as well. And then I mentioned the condition updates. Again, I know people don't want to give up their favorite ricing spot, but people willing to share notes, photos, what does the ripening look like on a lake, anything like that you're comfortable sharing, and we could share with other harvesters. I would definitely take that information. So again, the goal is for the long-term benefit of wild rice and have people who care about it. That's our goal with that. Then some bigger picture thoughts here. I kind of already mentioned harvest wild rice. We need people who use and care about the resource. Be aware, recognize, and appreciate this important resource, the cultural importance, things like that. Pay attention. It's not a weed when you're boating. Don't let others know if they're starting to pull rice in front of their cabin. Give them a little education on, that's not a weed. That's an important resource. And know the difference between wild rice and paddy rice. It's just a different product. And a lot of people, they go to these roadside stands. I don't think they really know that they're buying paddy or cultivated wild rice. So try to educate the people the difference on natural or wild rice as well. I think that's it. I know I sped through that pretty quick, but I invite you to check out our website. We have quite a bit of wild rice information, my contact information there as well. So feel free to check that out and follow up with me with any questions or information. Well, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, and we have questions. Don't you worry. So don't go anywhere.
All right.
We have, first question is about the boundary waters. So the first part is, can you harvest wild rice in the boundary waters? And are lakes in the boundary waters monitored through the 1854 Treaty Authority Wild Rice Program?
Yes, you can harvest wild rice in the boundary waters. You would just need a harvesting license. So a state harvester would require to get a state harvest license. Band members exercising treaty rights are not required to get a license, but as long as you have the appropriate identification or license, you can harvest in the boundary waters. And no, we don't do any monitoring or much in the boundary waters. None of our 10 lakes that we visit each year in the boundary waters. We're restricted a little bit with our flights to our annual 80 lakes we fly. We can maybe catch some on the edge of the boundary waters, but generally don't fly over the boundary waters. So not a lot of specific monitoring done in the boundary waters.
Awesome. Okay. So speaking of monitoring, let me go up here. Do you see an emerging role for remote sensing techniques? I mean, you did talk a little bit about it, but satellite images, drones, or other ideas, do you kind of see an emerging role for those techniques to monitor rice density and distribution patterns?
Great question. Yeah, so we've been talking about remote sensing for as long as I've been here, 25 years. And there's been different efforts through drones and satellites. My personal opinion is I don't think we're there yet, but I think we're heading down that path. The problem I see is sometimes if you're using those techniques over areas of real sparse wild rice, it has a tough time detecting it. And so that's continues to be my hang up, but there's been past projects, there's future projects coming up to keep working at that. So I do think that's the future, yes. And I've seen some drone work too. You can definitely get good photos with drones. So again, can you quantify rice with that, or are you just getting cool photos? Or some more steps need to be taken, but great question. I think we are heading there.
Awesome. Yeah. And when you are monitoring and doing all of these, you're like on the lake doing water quality and stuff like that. I noticed, like, do you look for other fungal diseases like ergot and stuff like that as well? Or are you mostly focused on the black spot and other things?
Yeah, it's mostly the brown spot. And I have not seen much ergot myself. Occasionally, and every couple years I get a call from a harvester asking about they see it somewhere. Just not something I have noticed a lot, and I probably need to pay a little better attention, but it's on our radar as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, definitely it's different in all of the lakes also. So if you're not on one of those lakes, sometimes you hit, I've definitely hit a lake that's got ergot everywhere, but is there an optimal time of year for restoration or reseeding of wild rice?
Yeah, reseeding can be done two ways. So if you get, again, you can't go on Amazon and get rice seed. So that's the biggest hang up is where do you get it? So you have to work with harvesters or harvest it yourself. And so that's a chore. Then once you get it, what do you do with it? The best way is to get it seeded soon after, within a few days, I would say, after buying it. So if you do keep it longer than that, you're required to store it underwater. So a lot of times in the past, people would store rice seed all winter, stored in a pond or something in burlap bags. But I find that just more cumbersome. So I am a big fan, get the seed and get it in as quick as you can. I mean, that's naturally how it's being seeded. So I think that's the way to go. Makes handling a lot easier as well.
Definitely, yeah.
So again, that would be in, you're buying the seed in, let's say, early September. So yep, seeding early to mid-September.
Yeah. Okay, and then next question is, most of the conservation concerns and efforts you mentioned dealt with climate change and competing species. Are there recorded instances of human overharvesting negatively impacting wild rice lakes?
I think I talked Peter David at Glyphic, if people know him, is kind of a long-term rice expert. He's done a little bit work on how inefficient harvesting is. I mean, when you're going through, you're knocking a lot off as you go, or when you knock it, it's going in the water anyway. So I don't think the actual taking of seed has a negative impact. It isn't thought to. If you are breaking stocks that way, if you're being harsh on the rice, that could have impact. But as far as the actual correct harvest of wild rice, I don't think it's an issue, no.
Well, that's good to know. Along those lines, with the airboat cuts that you do for the competing species, do you do that at a stage where the rice isn't impacted, or is it just kind of like you are kind of ripping up the rice as well, and just like for that year it's going to be bad? Or how does that work with the rice and the competing species with an airboat?
Yeah, good question. So ideally, you're working in an area where there's little or no rice, so it's not an issue. But if there is rice growing, with that technique, you are also impacting wild rice. So that is a concern. And like, say, a big rice example, for example, those particularly areas that are being cut has very little wild rice. So some is getting impacted for sure. So that is a decision point, and culturally too, the last thing working for bands I want to do is impact wild rice and other partners as well. So it's definitely a decision when you do a process like that.
Definitely, yeah. Going to talking about recording ice thickness and snow depths. That was really interesting to me. Is there a specific reason or direct relation to wild rice and how well it does, aside from just like water levels depending on ice thickness and snow depths? Or is it just good data to have in case you need to go back to it?
Yeah, I think we're looking to see if there's a connection or correlation. Spring water levels are obviously important for wild rice. So if you get really high spring levels and for a really long time, you're going to have generally a poorer wild rice year. So if you get heavy snows, late spring, deep water, you may have a poorer rice year. But we haven't really made a direct connection to ice thickness. It could be ice duration could be an issue. Again, what does that do to competing plants? So that's something we're still trying to tease out, I guess.
Definitely, yeah. I just thought that was really interesting. I was not expecting those two data points. Another question, each lake seems to have such a different wild rice. Some of them are tall, some are short, long grains, fat grains. This person says, isn't it important to only seed a lake with rice from that lake? Or is that, like, what do you think?
Yeah, another great question. So this is a long going debate around rice managers, essentially. Is it environmental factors? Is it genetics? Some of both. So by practice now, when seeding is done, it's usually, typically you can't get it from the exact same place you're seeding. So we try to stay like within the watershed is kind of the goal. So we try to get seed as close as possible to the location we're seeding is the ultimate goal. And there's a lot of debate. I mean, I think a lot of people think wild rice has moved around so much over the years. So it's tough to even know, where did it originate? But again, yeah, the goal is to try to get seed relatively close.
Okay, good to know. And this is a huge question. So we're going to have your expert opinion. What do you expect this coming season to look like for wild rice? We had a drought last year, and now with the way this winter's going, do you have a magic 8-ball, or what do you think, in your professional opinion, we're going to be seeing?
Yeah, I can answer this very perfectly. I have no idea. That's the thing about wild rice. It just surprises you. with the more snow at this point, I would say, potentially we'd have a little higher spring water level. So maybe that would be a little bit more of a down year, but it's so hard to tell, how soon does spring arrive? How quick does the melt happen? We get a lot of spring precipitation. It just wild rice always amazes, always surprises, and you just never know.
Definitely. I had a feeling you would say that, but I had to ask anyway because just in case. Let's see. Okay, so do you have time to harvest yourself?
I do, it's kind of strange. I probably get out every few years. I should get out more. It's one of those things, I'm out working with it every day, and then I don't make time to harvest as much as I should. So I harvest. I'm definitely not an expert harvester. I have a lot to learn about harvesting, and people who harvest or have harvested a long time know it's an artwork for sure.
Definitely, yeah. What is your favorite way to eat wild rice?
Well, that's a good question. My favorite way is, well, a couple ways. Wild rice soup. My wife makes excellent wild rice soup, so that's probably my favorite. My other favorite way is if I'm lucky enough to get a couple grouse, I love to bake the grouse and then add wild rice with cream of chicken soup and a little mozzarella on top in the oven. So those are my two favorite ways.
That's good. I'm sure some people are writing that down. um, so if anybody, that was all of the questions that I got. We did get quite a few people saying that if you need help culling Canada geese, count them in. So I know that we've all probably definitely noticed a problem with the geese, or a lot more geese the past couple of years. So that's definitely interesting. Yeah, I'll give a couple minutes for any last questions, but I think so. For those that are on the call right now and you want to know more, or you missed something, I will post the recording of this webinar on our website, finlandwildrice.com, along with Darren's slides, his contact information, and my contact information is on there as well. If you are a harvester and you saw that slide of like, what can you do, and you want to get involved, feel free to reach out to myself or Darren for sure. I know that it helps him a lot. It's only a small team and you can't get to every lake, which I know you have the top 10, but like we said, it's so different and it ranges on all of the lakes as far as how the rice is looking, any diseases, what's going on. So definitely reach out if you have any questions or want to get more involved. And I want to thank you, Darren, for coming. It was a great presentation. It was really awesome, and I learned a lot actually, and I am excited to tell my grandfather about the ice thickness and the snow depth thing. I think he would find that very interesting. So it doesn't look like we have any more questions. Thank you, miigwech, to everyone here, miigwech to Darren, and thank you so much for coming. And I'm really, really glad that you all took the time to be with us today. So thank you so much. Okay, somebody asked AIS for wild rice harvesting. Is it bad that I don't know what AIS stands for? Do you know what AIS stands for?
Yeah, aquatic invasive species. We've talked a little bit, more about educating that, because if we take our fishing boats around to different lakes, for example, they talk about clean, drain, dry. Wild rice kind of falls through the cracks a little bit. So there's been some talk about some education about cleaning your equipment if you're jumping lake to lake. So I think it's potentially a concern that maybe we need to do a little better job educating people about.
Yeah, I didn't even think of that. Thank you, Tara. That's a really good, really interesting nugget to think about. Yeah. Also, I apologize. I didn't know what AIS stood for. It's the end of the day. I'm sure you all get it, but now I do. Yeah, interesting. Awesome. Well,
I want to thank you for having me. I want to thank everyone who attended too. I know, people are busy at nights, but I appreciate people sitting in tonight, and for the interest in wild rice. I think it's important. So
yeah, thank you so much, and have a great night, everybody. Thank you, Darren. And we'll be in touch. We have Finland Wild Rice Facebook page, finlandwildrice.com, if you want to know anything from tonight, or want to give us a follow on Facebook. We do post some fun stuff. So miigwech, thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks all.